Good morning, everyone. I'm Teacher Bless. So today we will discuss about knitting. Objectives. At the end of the lesson, the students will be able to discuss the historical background of knitting, identify tools and materials used in knitting, determine the basic steps in knitting, and enumerate different stages of knitting. So what is knitting? Knitting is a process of using two or more needles to loop yarn into a series of interconnected loops in order to create a finished garment or to create a cloth. The origin of knitting is known to have been lost in the myths of ancient times. It was believed that the first knitters were probably a nomadic race living in the palace of North Africa. Knitting is a very adaptable craft. It could also be a good source of income. Ifugao women who shift from farming into knitting of stylish hats and scarves is one of the exemplary shared experience. It was through Meredith Ramirez Tulusan, co-founder of the Richfield Collective, who realized that the Ifugao people cannot survive with rice alone as they used to in the last few decades. These realizations inspired the creation of Ricefield Collective, a US-based online knitwear selling stylish products to an international clientele, which was also founded by English women Anna Maltz and a Filipina from Ifugao, Jean Mondieg. All knitters of the said company are Ifugao women. There are two methods of knitting. First, continental method. It is a customary knitting in many European and Eastern countries. The yarn is held over the left forefinger and related by the other fingers. The right hand needle digs in to the stitch of the left handle needle and hooks the yarn through it to make a new stitch. The stitch through which it has hooked has now attained its mission in life and becomes part of the fabric. Second is English method. Prevails in English-speaking countries. The yarn is held in the right hand over the forefinger and under others which regulate the tension. Some knitters wind the yarn around the various fingers, starting by one or more winds around the little finger. The knitter then digs the right hand needle point into the first stitch on the left hand needle and hooks the new stitch through. When reduced to its essential, can be by far the fastest in the annals of hand knitting. Terminology and abbreviations. It is important for you to be aware of the terms and abbreviations since most of the pattern with instruction or procedures is crafting knitted articles consists of abbreviations. Below are the common terms and abbreviations which you may encounter when making your knit articles. First is K for knit, P for pearl, SL for slipped, INC for increase, YO for yarn over, DEC for decrease, RND for round, INCL for inclusive, ST for stitch, SK for skipped, TOG for together, slip a ST for slip a stitch from one, BAG for beginning needle to the other with, PSSO for pass slip stitch, ALT for alternate, BET for between, and DP for double pointed needle. INCH or inches asterisk, it means that you must repeat everything after asterisk as many times as specified in instruction. One or more asterisks in the instruction indicates that the instructions following the symbol will be repeated a specified number of times. Parentheses in instructions indicates that the instructions within the parentheses are to be repeated a number of times. Knitting tools. One of the key factors to enjoy and have a smooth sailing knitting activity is to have a good quality of knitting tools. Aside from this, it has a great effect to the end product of any knitting articles. So these are the knitting tools. First is yarn. Yarn is a long continuous length of interlocked fibers, suitable for use in the production of textiles, sewing, crocheting, knitting, weaving, embroidery, and rope making. Second is knitting needle. Knitting needles are the most important tool in knitting. They come in a variety of styles and materials. Some of the most common knitting needles include plastic, metal, and wood. So, we have here some different types of knitting needle. First is a straight needle. Straight needle have a pointed end. When working with a pair of straight needles, the work is done with flat and in rows. Work across all the stitches on one needle, then turn work to other side and work across all stitches on other needle. Circular knitting needle are needles that are connected together with a cord. The cord is usually plastic but may be created out of other materials. The needles at each end of the cord are typically shorter than straight knitting needles. Third is double-pointed knitting needles. Are knitting needles with points at both ends. Usually it comes in sets of 4 and are used for doils, gloves, mittens, round necklines, socks, or whenever a seam is not used. Plastic knitting needle. These needles are used for beginners and are the least expensive. Plastic needles are lighter and more flexible than metal design. Metal knitting needle. Metal needle is stronger and more durable than other materials. However, metal knitting needles are cold to be touched. They also make clicking sounds while you knit. Wood knitting needle. Wood knitting needle are very popular. They are initially cold but will warm up from the heat given off by your hands. They are also smooth but not too smooth. Bamboo knitting needle. There are also knitting needles that are more made of bamboo. These needles are imported from Japan and are lightweight and strong. Bamboo designs are also less slippery than other designs, so your stitches will stay in better place. Resin knitting needles. Some knitting needles are made from resin. These needles are hollow, so they weigh less than many other materials. However, they are also strong, so they won't break easily. Glass knitting needle. One of the final materials used to make knitting needles is glass. Glass is heavier than other materials. They are also very smooth and slippery, so you may have trouble keeping stitches in place. So, the third knitting tools is stitch holders. Stitch holders hold open stitches when not being used by the needles. They can be used when finishing a side of an item, such as sweater, and preparing from the knitted stitch. They can be used on stitches separated from the needle when splitting the piece. For example, when shaping the neck hole of a sweater, the stitch holder is placed on the group of stitches used to make the neck hole, and the needles are used to continue to make the stitches on either side. Stitch markers. Stitch markers are used to help keep track on the number of stitches in a row or to indicate where a stitch pattern starts or ends. Scissors. In order to cut the excess yarn from your project, you need a pair of scissors. Either way, leave these scissors where you normally do your knitting or in your knitting bag because whenever you know when you might need them. Yarn bobbins. Yarn bobbins are made of plastic and come in several shapes and sizes. They hold small amounts of colored yarn. Sewing needles. Sewing needles are helpful for weaving in the ends of your knitting project and for sewing together pieces of a garment, such as putting the arms on a sweater. You can find needles suitable for working with your yarn in plastic and metal. Crochet hook. Crochet hook border on a knitted garment is a very nice touch, but crochet hooks can come in handy even for those who don't know a sewing needle. A crochet hook is invaluable tool. Cable needles. Cable needles are a special kind of knitting needle used specially to hold stitches in the front or behind your knitting so that the stitches can be picked up and knitted after knitting or stitches first. Knit gauge. One of the best things you can do help with success of reading project is to knit a gauge swatch. Gauge is very important in getting knitted items the right size. So those are the knitting tools that we use in knitting. Basic steps and knitting. First is slip knot. A slip knot is a starting point of everything you do in knitting and is the basis for the cast on. So these are the steps on how to make slip knot. First step is make a circle with yarn about 12 inches from end. Second, pull a loop through the circle. Third, insert the needle to the loop. Fourth, pull the loop gently and evenly to tighten and slide the knot up to the needle. Second basic steps in knitting is cast on. Broken down in a very simple terms, knitting is just a matter of transferring loops from one needle to another. To get started, you need to pull loops on a one needle, and that process of creating loops is called casting on. There are several methods of casting on. Each has a unique purpose and procedures are different age. Try different methods to find the one most comfortable and suitable to your project. So the first example or types of casting on is long tail cast on. This method of casting on produces a very elastic edge, which is particularly used when followed by garter stitch or stockend stitch. Measure approximately 1 inches of yarn for each stitch needed and make a slip knot at this point. So the first step in making long tail cast on is place slip knot on needle, counts as first stitch and hold needle in right hand with the skin end of the yarn over your first finger. Wind the tail end of the yarn around your left thumb from the front to back. Second, bring needle down in front of thumb. Third, insert point under loop in front of thumb. Fourth, bring tip of needle under loop in index finger. Follow direction of arrow. Fifth, pull needle down through loop or on thumb following direction of arrow. Sixth, this form a stitch on needle. And last, repeat instruction for each stitch to be cast on, counting each loop on needle, including the slip knot as a stitch. Second type of cast on is backwards loop cast on. This is the easiest way to cast on, but the resulting edge might not be suitable for all projects. First step is when the slip knot on the needle, wrap around your right index finger. Second, insert tip of needle under loop. Third, remove finger and pull yarn gently to slung loop around needle. Last, if loops on needle are too tight, you will not be able to knit into these stitches, so practice until loops are consistent. The third basic stitches in knitting is knit stitch. First step is with the working yarn at the back, insert right hand needle into first stitch, left hand needle from front to back. Second, wrap yarn around right hand needle from left to right over the point of the needle. Third, pull wrap through the stitch, forming a loop on the right hand needle. Fourth, slip the stitch off the left hand needle. When all the stitches on the left hand needle have been transferred to the right hand needle, turn the work and place the needle with the stitches on it to the left hand to start the next row. Purl stitch. First step in making purl stitch is with the working yarn at the front, insert right hand needle into first stitch on left hand needle from back to front. Second, wrap your yarn, wrap your yarn around right hand needle from right to the left over the point of the needle. Third, pull wrap through the stitch. Fourth, forming a loop on the right hand needle, slip the stitch off the left hand needle. When all the stitches on the left hand needle have been transferred to the right hand needle, turn the work and place the needle with the stitches on it to the left hand to start the next row. So those are the basic stitches in knitting. There are different stitches of knitting. First is courses and wheels. Structure of stocking stitch, a common weave in knitting fabric. The meandering red paths defines one course, the path of the yarn through the fabric. The uppermost white loops are unsecured and active, but they secure the red loops suspended from them. In turn, the red loops secure the white loops just below them, which is in turn secure the loops below them, and so on. So this is the example given picture example of courses and wheels. So, like weaving, knitting is a technique for producing a two-dimensional fabric made from a one-dimensional yarn or thread. In weaving, threads are always straight, running parallel either lengthwise or crosswise. By contrast, the yarn in knitted fabric follows a meandering path, forming symmetrical loops, symmetrical above and below the mean path of the yarn. Second, different stitches of knitting is weft and wrap knitting. There are two major varieties of knitting, weft knitting and weft knitting. In the more common weft knitting, the wheels are perpendicular to the course of the yarn. In wrap knitting, the wheels and courses run roughly parallel. In weft knitting, the entire fabric may be produced from a single yarn by adding stitches to each wheel in turn, moving across the fabric as in a raster scan. By contrast, in weft knitting, one yarn is required for every wheel. Since a typical piece of knitting fabric may have hundreds of wheels, weft knitting is typically done by machine, whereas weft knitting is done by both hand and machine. Weft knitted fabrics such as tricot and melanis are resistant to runs and are commonly used in lingerie. So in the picture below, it is the example of weft and wrap knitting. Knit and purl stitches. In securing the previous stitch in a wheel, the next stitch can pass through the previous loop, from either below or above. If the former, the stitch is denoted as a knit stitch or a plain stitch, if the latter as a purl stitch. The two stitches are related in that a knit stitch, since seen from one side of a fabric, appears as a purl stitch on the other side. The two types of stitches have a different visual effect. The knit stitches look like V stuck vertically, whereas the purl stitch look like a wavy horizontal line across the fabric. So, in the picture given is the example of knit and purl stitches. Fourth, right and left plaited stitches. The stitches on the right are right plaited, whereas the stitches on the left are left plaited. Within limits, an arbitrary number of twists may be added to new stitches, whether they be knit or purl. Here a single twist is illustrated with left plaited and right plaited stitches. On the left and right, respectively, illustration of interlock. The blue and white wheels are parallel to each other, but both are perpendicular to the black and gold wheels, resembling basket waving. Fifth, edges and joints between fabrics. The initial and final edges of a knitted fabric are known as the cast-on and bound or cast-off edges. The side edges are known as the selvage. The word derives from self edges, meaning that the stitches do not need to be secured by anything else. Many types of selvages have been developed, with different elastic and ornamental properties. Vertical and horizontal edges can be introduced within a knitted fabric for buttonholes by binding or cast off and recasting on again, or by knitting the fabric on either side of a vertical edge separately. Sixth, cables, increases, and lace. Stitches are knitted in the same order in every row, and the wales of the fabric run parallel and vertically along the fabric. However, this need not to be, since the order in which stitches are knitted may be permuted so that wales cross over one another, forming a cable pattern. Cable patterns tend to draw the fabric together, making it denser and less elastic. Aran sweaters are a common form of knitted cabling. Arbitrary complex braid patterns can be done in cable knitting, with the preview that the wheels must move ever upwards. It is generally impossible for a wheel to move up and then down the fabric. Knitters have developed methods for giving the illusion of a circular wave, such as appearing in Celtic knots, but these are inexact approximations. However, such circular waves are possible using sweets, darning, a form of embroidery, or by knitting a tube separately and attaching it to the knitted fabric. The last different stitches of knitting is ornamentations and additions. Various point-like ornaments may be added to knitting for their look or to improve the wear of the fabric. Examples including various types of bubbles, sequins, and beads. Loom loops can also be drawn out, and secured, forming a shaggy texture to the fabric. This is known as loop knitting. Additional patterns can be made on the surface of the knitting fabric using embroidery. If the embroidery resembles knitting, it is often called Swiss darning. Various closures for the garments, such as frogs and buttons, can be added. Usually, buttonholes are knitted into the garment rather than cut. Ornamental pieces may be also knitted separately and then attached using a plait. For example, differently colored leaves and petals on a flower could be knit separately and attached to form the final picture. Separately knitted tubes can be applied to a knitted fabric to form complex, Celtic knots and other patterns that would be difficult to knitting. Unknitted yarns may be worked into knitted fabrics for warmth, as is done in tufting and weaving, also known as coaching. So, for today, we have a activity. So, by group, look up some examples of finished knitting project photos and label them with the names of the stitches. So, this activity will determine how you understand our lesson for today. So we have here your assignment. Instruction. Find out more about the locations where knitting was invented and how it aided in their development. So that will be all. Thank you for listening. God bless us all. Thank you.